Welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, this year's Munich Security Conference exposed both anxiety and renewed resolve within the West. From calls for tougher sanctions on Russia and stronger European defense to appeals for revitalizing transatlantic ties, leaders debated whether the old order is fading or being rebuilt. Joining us today on TVP World to sum up Munich is Krzysztof Jaworski, Director of International Affairs at the Institute for Security and International Development. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So after this conference, where do you think transatlantic relations lie after this year's conference? We saw Rubio's participation taking a more reassurance tone after events this last year's more confrontational one.
We tend to focus on this picture instead of looking at the whole movie, and Munich Security Conference is just another episode, just another part of the longer trend of change in transatlantic relations. And while, of course, Marco Rubio offered much more friendlier tone in his speech than Vice President Vance last year in the same place, the main message, in my opinion, is the same. U.S. message is that they are no longer able to unilaterally coordinate every important things regarding international world order, international security, and they, on the one hand, expect Europe to talking simply, pay more for the security. However, at the same time, they would like this more independent in military means Europe to remain dependent on US and for this Europe to align with U.S. interests, for example, when it comes to trade with China, for example. So, in my opinion, Marco Rubio, of course, was much more diplomatic than his predecessor from the last year. However, the main message that the Europe should be junior partner of the United States was the same.
Right, but like you mentioned, he's taking a more diplomatic tone, even quoting words like, quoting Rubio, America is a child of Europe. Do you think that it's also like a signal of continuity as well, or is it more just, like you mentioned, a diplomatic language?
Well, I think that there could be several factors which are not totally contradictory. They could coexist simultaneously. So one thing is that inside Trump's administration there are several factions, and as far as we know, Marco Rubio is representative of other line than J.D. Vance. So maybe it's the sign that this Marco Rubio's faction, or people who are of similar mind to him, they are getting better position inside Trump administration. However, it also could be that they coordinate each other to offer, well, to play this game of a bad cop and a good cop. So both of these things could also be true at the same time.
Right. Another thing that I want to unpack a little bit is how Rubio is saying that it is unclear whether Russia truly wants peace. And I'm coming at it from both approach, because if you compare it to Trump's usual rhetoric that Russia wants peace, it does deviate a little bit from there. But if you look at it from a European perspective, where we're pretty clear that that's not what Russia wants, it seems to deviate to the other direction as well. So in the grand scheme of things, like you mentioned, looking at it as a whole movie instead of an isolated picture, in which way is the Washington scale tipping?
Well, so to comment shortly on this matters related to U.S. and Trump's approach towards Russia, I think that we can say that words are very cheap. So for Trump, it's like a cheap way to try to negotiate with Russia by appeasing it, by praising it, even if the talk. However, if we look at the ground, the picture is more complicated, because U.S. is still supporting Ukraine, even if the main financial wage of this support shifted towards Europe. U.S. is also competing with Russia on the other theaters, like Venezuela, like Caucasus. So, of course, Trump is talking really nicely to Putin, but behind his back he keeps the hard stick, and he's ready to possibly use it. And when it comes to this longer trend you asked me about, in my opinion, we need to get back to the very source of this disruption in the world order, and it's the rise of China, because if we are talking about the West decline, or some talk about US decline, it doesn't mean that West or US is weaker than it was 10 years or 20 years ago in absolute terms. It is weaker relatively. So it means that US is no longer able to impose its will by the sole perception of the other side that competing with US would be pointless, because at the end US is so much more powerful than every possible competitor that to openly compete them is, it's a way to get a disaster.
Right.
So that's why US needs to right now order this scarce resources of itself in a better, more efficient way, and that's why US is pressuring Europe so much. Because, of course, they can offer a narrative like Marco Rubio that it's common interest, but even if some of people in US thinks this way, the first and the priority is always US interest, and it's natural.
Right. And like you mentioned, with the rise of China, U.S. is also worried about its own competitiveness as well. And if they want to sprint full speed ahead, then perhaps it's not very conducive for them to have to drag other party members along. Now, coming back to Europe, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, also called for activating the EU's mutual defense clause and moving majority voting on security. Do you think politically Europe is actually ready for that kind of leap?
Well, that's a very complicated question because it depends on so many factors and so many decisions inside each of capitals of each European Union countries, and each of these governments has its own calculation which is of course dependent on the polls and on the effect of such decisions on their elections results. So I wouldn't say that it's impossible. However, as we look back at these 4 years of many important discussions and many ambitious goals that were set, I think that the reality is somewhere in between. It's not like Europe is totally stagnant, but if we look at how ambitious the goals, the declarations were, it's also not something what really happened.
Right. So what do you think it means for individual countries within Europe to have to start operating with the scaling back of the United States? Do you see some political divide in some countries that still want to cling on to the idea of this reliance on the U.S. and compared to a more independent way of functioning?
Well, definitely it is something present in the public discussions, in expert discussion, and it's also wise to assume that it's better to have some capabilities, some tools, some possibilities on your own which are independent. It is also better if you still want to remain ally. However, if you have better negotiation position, it's making this relation better for you also. It's not against the alliance, but it's to make this alliance working better for you. When it comes to the specific details, the outcomes of such propositions, of such discussions, the landscape is also complicated. However, we can say that such things like, for example, munition production is now much higher in Europe. It's, of course, good for Europe's security. Of course, we have to constantly have in mind the way that the war in Ukraine is going. And for now, after almost 4 years, while it is very hard and it's a lot of harm for Ukraine, the Ukraine still stands and it's even able to counterattack sometimes, and also it imposes huge costs on Russia. So as for now, this factor, it is not a disaster for Europe also.
Right. Now, I also want to point to High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas, because she's warned that Russia could gain more at the negotiating table than on the battlefield. Now, can you help us understand what specifically is she talking about and what risk is she pointing to?
Well, in my opinion, the risk, and it's something we observe in these next episodes of negotiation and next propositions by Trump's administration, is that US will decide, and their assessment will be that Russia is weakened enough for US not to be afraid that Russia could interrupt in their interest globally. However, in my opinion, they would like Russia also not to collapse or not to be weakened too much. So the Russia remains this factor which is imposing pressure at Europe, which makes Europe more tend to align with US interests. So it's like the question of balance. Nor winning Russia nor losing totally Russia would be good for US in this moment. That's what I think the decision makers in Washington are thinking, and that's why they try to balance this process of negotiations.
Right. So now let's sum up some of the comments, because with the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, that closing up, they are arguing Europe needs action, not speeches. What concrete steps do you think should follow the conference to make sure that, like I mentioned, there's more action being taken?
So definitely this should be steps taken on the level of governments of each country, also on the level of European Union. One thing is financing and long-term planning and long-term execution also, because planning is not enough when it comes to defense industry. And as we already mentioned in our discussion, there are some positive signs, munition production, the general landscape of buying and producing military equipment. However, Europe should, and it requires political decision and endurance of this decision, focus on these areas where it is fully dependent on United States. It's like long-term missiles, like satellites. Of course, there are several capabilities also there. However, it's the question of scaling up and integrating inside Europe. And of course, it's also the problem of trade-offs, because maybe in some situations it is economically more efficient to buy it, for example, from US. In short term or even in the medium term, but maybe also in long term it will be better to have more domestically produced weapons and systems. And there, I think it's the elephant in the room in this whole process, is the question who will gain the most on it.
Yeah.
Germany, France, UK, which is discussed whether it should be included or not because it's not in European Union, or maybe our own Polish defense industries. And it's a very complicated process of negotiations between these specific companies and governments. And it takes time, it takes to get to the conclusion when the interests are contradictory in many matters.
All right, there's so many parts of that moving puzzle. We have various countries' interests involved, we have transatlantic ties, and also, like you mentioned, there's a difference between short-term thinking and long-term thinking as well. So even just talking about taking action here, it involves so many different ways to approach. We'll have to see how that turns out. Now, we do have a little bit of time before we let you go. If someone were to tune into this conference, there's a lot of speeches, a lot of great quotes being made, but if you want to point to like a specific speech or even a specific quote that I think is most pivotal in this conference, what would you say that is?
So generally, I would say that the most important speech was a speech by Marco Rubio, which we discussed. Is of course because transatlantic relations and the geostrategy of United States and how it interacts with strategy of other important actors is the main factor which will shape how the future of the security order, of the international order will look. And for me personally, very good and very interesting speech was a speech by President Zelensky,
right,
which I think was very good both on this rhetoric level with some of the jokes, for example, this one regarding Viktor Orban, who is growing his belly instead of his army.
Right.
I enjoyed it. But when it comes to the serious matters, I also think that Zelensky offered this serious, very realistic approach because he is in the most possible serious situation and he is dealing with it.
Right, definitely. So a lot to tune into. Thank you so much for helping us round that all up. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Thank you very much.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.